October 27th, 1969. The air inside the Soviet early warning radar station, buried deep beneath the permafrost of the Chukchi Peninsula, is stale. It smells of ozone, cheap tobacco, and the metallic tang of overheated vacuum tubes. Outside, the Arctic wind howls across the frozen tundra, a desolate landscape of white nothingness that separates the Soviet Union from the state of Alaska. But inside, the world is reduced to the green sweep of a phosphor screen and the rhythmic hum of ventilation fans. A young radar operator, his eyes rimmed with red from a 12-hour shift, watches the glowing scan line rotate. Sweep, nothing. Sweep, nothing. Then, a ghost appears. It is a faint return, hovering at the very edge of the station's maximum range. The operator blinks, leaning closer to the glass. In this sector, traffic is usually non-existent. Perhaps a weather anomaly. Perhaps a flock of migratory birds, though the altitude is wrong. He adjusts the gain, sharpening the image. The ghost resolves. It is not a bird. It is not a cloud. It is metal. Large metal. He grabs the headset, his hand trembling slightly. Before he can key the mic, the screen changes again. The single blip splits. It is not one aircraft. It is two. Then three. Then five. The returns are massive, moving in a tight formation that implies heavy discipline and heavier tonnage. They are flying high, climbing past 30,000 feet, cruising at a speed that suggests they are heavy with fuel. Within minutes, the single anomaly has become a swarm. 18 massive contacts are pushing up from the American airspace over Alaska, heading northwest. They are heading directly toward the polar ice cap. Directly toward the Soviet border. The operator's heart hammers against his ribs. This is not a drill signature. He knows the patterns of American reconnaissance flights. The RC-135 aircraft stay low and passive. The U-2 aircraft fly high and silent. These contacts are doing neither. They are screaming their presence to the world. They are flying with transponders active, radiating energy, practically daring the Soviet radar net to see them. He screams for the shift commander. Alarms begin to blare. A harsh, mechanical shriek that tears through the silence of the outpost. In the command bunker, phones are snatched from cradles. Codes are shouted. The peaceful monotony of the Cold War has just been shattered. To the men staring at those screens, this looks like the beginning of the end. The profile of the contacts is unmistakable. These are Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers, the heavy hammer of the United States Air Force. 18 of them. If this is a first strike, it is clumsy. You do not send 18 bombers alone to end the world. You send hundreds, you send missiles. But if it is not a first strike, then what is it? The confusion that begins in a frozen bunker in Siberia travels at the speed of light along secure landlines to Moscow. It bypasses the lower chain of command, surging straight to the Vojska PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Generals are woken from their sleep. Maps are unrolled on long wooden tables. Grease pencils mark the trajectory of the American flight group. The trajectory is erratic. The bombers are not flying a direct attack vector toward Vladivostok or Moscow. They are flying toward the emptiness of the Arctic Ocean. They are heading for the gap between Greenland and the Soviet coastline. But the most terrifying detail is not where they are going, but what they are carrying. As the Soviet interceptors fast, Delta-winged MiG-21 aircraft and long-range Tu-128 interceptors scramble from airfields in the north to shadow this formation. They report back a visual confirmation that chills the blood of the Kremlin leadership. The American bombers are fully loaded. Under the sweeping wings of the B-52 aircraft, the Soviet pilots see the distinctive shapes of external fuel tanks, but they also detect the electronic signatures of live warheads. These are not training dummies. These are not concrete-filled shapes used for weight simulation. These are thermonuclear gravity bombs, hydrogen weapons. Each aircraft is carrying enough explosive power to flatten a major city. Multiplied by 18, this formation represents an extinction-level event, floating 35,000 feet above the ice. This is the mystery that paralyzes the Soviet High Command in late October of 1969. The United States is locked in a brutal, dragging war in Vietnam. They are bleeding money and men in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Washington is besieged by protests. The American president is under immense pressure. Why, in the middle of a conventional war in the jungle, would the Americans suddenly send a nuclear armada to the Arctic? It defies all strategic logic. If the Americans wanted to attack, they would rely on the element of surprise. They would use their new ICBMs, the Minuteman missiles, sitting in silos in the Dakotas. Bombers are slow. Bombers are detectable. Sending 18 bombers to the edge of Soviet airspace is not a tactical move, it is a theatrical one. But theater with nuclear weapons is a game of Russian roulette where the gun is pointed at the entire planet. If you want to understand the hidden history of the Cold War and the moments we almost lost everything, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact right now. Back in Moscow, the atmosphere is electric with tension. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev is briefed. The question on everyone's lips is simple. Why? Is this a mistake? A rogue commander? Or is this a prelude to something darker? The Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, frantically begins to sift through intercepted communications. They are looking for the trigger. Did a Soviet submarine accidentally sink an American ship? Did a skirmish in Berlin go hot? There is nothing. The world is relatively quiet, except for Vietnam. There is no crisis in Europe. There is no crisis in Cuba. Yet, 18 bombers are clawing their way through the thin air of the stratosphere, their engines leaving contrails that look like scars across the sky. The Soviet radar operators track them as they cross the invisible line of the sophisticated distant early warning systems. The bombers push further north. They are now flying over the polar ice cap. This is the Chrome Ball route, the shortest distance between the United States and the Soviet industrial heartland. For the Soviet pilots shadowing them, the tension is unbearable. They are flying wing to wing with the enemy. They can see the helmeted heads of the American tail gunners. They can see the blackened exhaust stains on the fuselage of the B-52 aircraft. One slip of a finger, one misunderstood maneuver. If an American gunner thinks a Soviet fighter is locking on, he might open fire. If a Soviet pilot thinks the bomber is opening its bomb bay doors, he will launch his missiles. The margin for error is zero. And then, the Americans do something that makes no sense. They do not turn toward a target. They do not turn back to base. They begin to circle. 18 massive bombers, heavy with nuclear death, enter a holding pattern over the Arctic ice. They are burning thousands of gallons of fuel every hour. They are circling like vultures waiting for a carcass. They are close enough to the Soviet border to be a clear and present danger, but just far outside the legal boundary of sovereign airspace to avoid being an act of war. It is a taunt, a silent, terrifying taunt. In the Kremlin, the confusion turns to a cold, hard dread. This is not standard operating procedure. The Americans have maintained an airborne alert system for years, Operation Chrome Dome, where they kept bombers in the air 24/7. But those were routine patrols, single aircraft flying predictable loops. This is a massed formation. This is a strike force that has stopped just short of the trigger line. The Soviet Defense Minister Andrei Grechko demands answers from the KGB. What is happening in Washington? What is President Nixon doing? The intelligence reports coming from the Soviet embassy in Washington are chaotic. They paint a picture of an administration that has gone silent. The usual diplomatic backchannels are cold. The American military has raised its readiness level globally. It looks like the United States is preparing for World War III. But why now? This is the central mystery that the Soviets cannot crack. They look at the map of Vietnam. The war there is a stalemate. The Americans are frustrated, yes, but are they desperate? Desperate enough to threaten nuclear holocaust over a strip of jungle in Southeast Asia? It seems impossible. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction relies on rationality. It relies on the assumption that neither side wants to die. You do not risk New York and Moscow for Saigon. It is not a fair trade. But as the hours tick by, and the bombers keep circling, a terrifying possibility begins to dawn on the Soviet analysts. What if the man in the White House is not rational? They analyze the psychological profile of the new American president, Richard Nixon. He is known to be aggressive. He is known to be anti-communist. But is he unstable? The radar screens continue to glow. The blips continue their endless hypnotic circle. For the pilots in the cockpits of the B-52 aircraft, the mission is equally baffling. They were pulled from their beds, briefed in secure rooms, and told to fly a mission that had no target. They are carrying live nukes, but they have no release codes. They are flying in a formation that makes them vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. They are bait. But bait for what? The Soviet military machine begins to shift gears. Mobile missile launchers in the Soviet Far East are driven out of their garages and into firing positions. Submarines are ordered to dive and prepare for launch orders. The entire nuclear triad of the Soviet Union begins to wake up. This is exactly the reaction that a surprise attack is supposed to prevent. If you are going to hit the enemy, you hit them before they can wake up. You do not fly 18 bombers to their front porch and ring the doorbell for 3 hours. The behavior is so counterintuitive that the Soviet analysts begin to suspect a trap. Is this a diversion? Are the bombers here to draw the Soviet fighters north, leaving the southern flank exposed? Is there another fleet of bombers coming from Turkey? Or from the Pacific? They scour the skies. Nothing. Just the 18 ghosts in the north. The suspense in the Soviet Situation Room is suffocating. They are watching a clock tick down, but they do not know when the alarm will ring. They are waiting for the bombers to turn south. Every time a B-52 aircraft banks slightly, hearts stop in Moscow. Is this it? Is this the turn? But the bombers just complete another circle. The sun begins to dip low on the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the ice. The pilots are tired. The airframes are vibrating. The world is holding its breath. And then, the Americans escalate. The radio intercepts pick up new orders. The bombers are not returning to base. They are refueling. Aerial tankers are being dispatched to the Arctic Circle. The KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft are rising to meet the bombers. This means the Americans intend to keep this fleet in the air. They're going to keep this nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over the Soviet Union through the night. And maybe through the next day. This is not a drill. This is a siege. The Soviets realize they are facing a new kind of weapon. It is not the bomb itself. It is the uncertainty. The Americans are weaponizing fear. They are weaponizing the unknown. But the question remains, burning in the minds of the men in the Kremlin. What does Nixon want? If they cannot answer that question, they will be forced to shoot. And if they shoot, the world burns. As the first tanker connects with the lead bomber, thousands of gallons of jet fuel transfer in mid-air, extending the nightmare. The Soviet leadership is paralyzed by the lack of information. They need to know what is happening inside the Oval Office. They need to know if the American president has lost his mind. Because looking at the radar screen, looking at those 18 unblinking eyes circling the pole, it certainly looks like madness. But in the high-stakes game of nuclear poker, madness can be a strategy. And the Soviets are about to find out just how far Richard Nixon is willing to push the chips into the center of the table. October 28, 1969. The sun rises over the frozen expanse of the Bering Sea, but the tension does not break with the dawn. Above the ice, the aluminum overcast remains. The 18 B-52 Strato Fortress bombers are still there. They have been circling for 24 hours. For the flight crews strapped into the cramped, freezing cockpits, the mission has turned into a physical ordeal. Their limbs are cramping, their bladders are full. They are surviving on bitter coffee and boxed rations, fighting the hypnotic drone of the engines and the sheer boredom that comes with waiting for the apocalypse. But they cannot relax. Every time they drift near the edge of the Soviet radar net, the Soviet interceptors, the fast, agile MiG-21 aircraft, dart in close. The American pilots can see the Soviet pilots checking their watches. They are timing the patrols. They are measuring the endurance of the American fleet. Down below, on the ground, the mystery is deepening. In the Pentagon, the operation is known as Giant Lance. It is one of the most highly classified secrets in the United States military. The American public knows nothing about it. The press knows nothing. There are no headlines in the New York Times about nuclear bombers threatening Russia. The anti-war protesters marching in Washington are shouting about Vietnam, completely unaware that the real danger is currently idling at 35,000 feet over the Arctic. This secrecy is the first clue that confuses the Soviet intelligence analysts. Usually, when a superpower flexes its muscles, it wants the world to see. It wants the propaganda victory. But President Nixon has drawn a curtain of silence around this operation. He does not want the American voters to know what he is doing. He only wants one specific audience to see this show. He wants the men in the Kremlin to see it. In Moscow, the Soviet General Staff is holding emergency meetings in the Ministry of Defense. The mood is grim. Marshal Andrei Grechko, a man who survived the brutal tank battles of the Second World War, looks at the map with growing unease. He knows the logistics of war. He knows that keeping 18 heavy bombers in the air around the clock is ruinously expensive. It burns fuel at a rate that would drain a small country's economy. It wears out airframes. It exhausts elite crews. You do not do this for training. You do not do this for a bluff. You do this when you are preparing to kick down the door. The Soviets begin to look for the second front. If the bombers are the distraction, where is the real knife? They turn their electronic ears toward Europe. They monitor the radio traffic of the NATO forces in West Germany. They watch the submarine pens in Scotland. Silence. The rest of the American military is at a normal state of readiness, except for the nuclear forces. The Strategic Air Command SAC is the only branch that is hyperactive. This isolation makes the situation even more terrifying. It suggests that this is not a general military mobilization. It is a surgical nuclear threat. The Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, is ordered to find answers. Dobrynin is a veteran diplomat, a man who knows the corridors of Washington better than most Americans. He has survived the Cuban Missile Crisis. He knows how the game is played. But when he tries to reach out to his contacts in the State Department, he hits a wall. The usual back channels are silent. When he finally gets a meeting with Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, the interaction is bizarre. Kissinger does not offer reassurances. He does not talk about de-escalation. Instead, he looks worried. He speaks in hushed tones, implying that he is no longer in full control of the president. This is the moment the seed of true fear is planted in the Soviet mind. Dobrynin cables back to Moscow with a disturbing report. He describes an administration that feels unhinged. He reports that President Nixon is obsessed with the Vietnam War, frustrated by the lack of progress, and furious with the North Vietnamese stalling tactics in Paris. The Soviets connect the dots. Nixon promised to end the war in Vietnam. He has been in office for 9 months, and the war is still raging. He is losing political capital. He is being cornered. A cornered animal is dangerous. A cornered president with the nuclear launch codes is catastrophic. The Soviet analysts begin to ask the forbidden question, is Richard Nixon rational? They pull the files on Nixon. They study his past. They see a man who is prone to anger, who holds grudges, who drinks. They see a man who feels persecuted by the media and the political establishment. If such a man feels he is about to lose his presidency because of a war in a jungle halfway around the world, would he flip the table? Would he decide that if he cannot win in Vietnam, he will escalate the conflict to a global level to force a solution? This is the nightmare scenario for the Soviet Union. They rely on the Americans being predictable. Capitalist, greedy, imperialist, yes. But predictable. They assume the Americans want to survive to spend their money. But if the American leader is willing to burn the house down to kill a spider, the rules of deterrence no longer apply. Back in the Arctic, the situation escalates further. On day 2, the weather turns. A massive polar storm system begins to swirl off the coast of Alaska. Visibility drops to 0. The turbulence becomes violent. For the B-52 pilots, flying a heavy bomber loaded with nuclear weapons in a blizzard is a suicide mission. Standard safety protocols dictate that the mission should be aborted. The plane should return to base or disperse to safer holding patterns south of the storm. But the order from the White House is absolute. Hold the line. The bombers stay in the storm. The Soviet radar operators watch in disbelief. They see the blips bouncing erratically on the screens as the aircraft are tossed around by 100-mile-per-hour winds. They know that mid-air refueling in these conditions is nearly impossible. The fuel boom operator in the tanker has to thread a metal needle into a receptacle on the bomber while both planes are bucking like wild horses in the dark. One spark, one collision, and a hydrogen bomb falls into the ice. The Soviets realize that the Americans are risking a broken arrow, a nuclear accident just to prove a point. This recklessness convinces the Kremlin that this is not a drill. No commander risks his own nuclear arsenal in a storm unless the stakes are existential. The Soviet military goes to its next level of alert. In the missile fields of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, the silo covers are partially retracted to test the mechanisms. It is a signal that can be seen by American spy satellites. It is a warning. We see you. We are ready. But the 18 bombers do not flinch. They continue their vigil. The psychological pressure on the Soviet leadership is becoming unbearable. They are sleep-deprived. They are drinking heavily. The ghost of 1941 haunts them, the memory of the Nazi surprise attack. They swore never to be caught off guard again. General Secretary Brezhnev paces his office. He demands to know if the Americans have issued an ultimatum. Has a telegram arrived? Has a phone call been made? No, Comrade General Secretary, his aides tell him. Nothing. The silence is the weapon. If the Americans demanded something, get out of Berlin or stop supplying Vietnam, the Soviets could negotiate. They could stall. They could bargain. But you cannot negotiate with silence. You can only project your own fears into it. And the fear taking over Moscow is that Nixon has decided to try something radical: the nuclear blockade. The theory circulates that Nixon is preparing to mine the harbors of North Vietnam with nuclear devices, or perhaps use tactical nuclear weapons to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he is parking his strategic bombers on the Soviet border to say, "Do not interfere. If you try to stop me in Vietnam, I will hit you here." It is a gangster move. It is holding a gun to the head of the Soviet Union while mugging their ally in the alleyway. The Soviets are trapped. If they do nothing, and Nixon nukes Vietnam, they look weak. Their allies in the communist world, China, Cuba, North Korea, will see them as paper tigers. But if they attack the bombers now, they start a war that ends civilization. They are paralyzed by the ambiguity of the threat. Meanwhile, inside the American bombers, the strain is reaching a breaking point. The crews have been awake for too long. The go pills amphetamines issued to pilots are wearing off, replaced by the jitters and the crash. Hallucinations are common in sensory deprivation. Staring at the white void of the Arctic for 30 hours does strange things to the mind. One pilot reports seeing lights that aren't there. Another struggles to keep his aircraft level as vertigo sets in. The margin for disaster is shrinking. And then, on the third day, a new variable enters the equation. A Soviet submarine, a November-class nuclear attack sub, surfaces in the gap between the ice floes. It is directly below the flight path of the bombers. It is not hiding. It is sitting on the surface, its radar masts spinning. It is a listening post. But it is also a target. If an American bomber crew, hallucinating from fatigue, mistakes the submarine's radar lock for a missile launch, they have standing orders to defend themselves. They carry AGM-28 Hound Dog missiles, supersonic nuclear cruise missiles, slung under their wings. The pilot does not need a code from the president to fire a defensive missile if he is under attack. The trigger is now in the hands of an exhausted 25-year-old captain from Ohio, flying a shaking metal box over the top of the world. The fate of the human species rests on his discipline. The Soviets watch the submarine, the Americans watch the bombers. The world is a powder keg, and Richard Nixon is sitting in the Oval Office, playing with a box of matches, refusing to tell anyone which one he intends to light. The mystery has shifted from "what are they doing?" to "when will it break?" Because something has to break. Machines fail. Men snap. Luck runs out. As the third night of Operation Giant Lance begins, the Soviet leadership comes to a terrifying conclusion. They cannot wait for the Americans to clarify their intentions. They have to assume the worst. They prepare to issue the order that has been locked in a safe for 20 years. The order to preempt. If the bombers do not turn back by dawn, the Soviet Union will have to assume an attack is imminent. They will have to shoot the archer before he looses the arrow. The countdown has begun, but only one side knows the clock is ticking. October 29th, 1969. 70 hours. The crews of the 18 B-52 Stratofortress bombers have been in the air for nearly 3 full days. The physiological limit of the human body in a pressurized cockpit is being tested in real time. Inside the lead aircraft, the smell is revolting. A mixture of unwashed bodies, spilled hydraulic fluid, and the acrid stench of stale coffee. The pilots are no longer flying, they are merely existing. Their movements are sluggish, their eyes glazed. The constant vibration of the 8 engines has rattled their bones for so long that they feel numb even when they touch their own faces. This is the danger zone. This is where mistakes happen. A young co-pilot in the third bomber drift naps for a split second. His hand twitches on the yoke. The massive aircraft, weighing nearly 500,000 pounds, lurches to the left. It drops 300 feet in seconds, sliding dangerously close to the turbulent wake of the bomber in front of it. Wake turbulence from a B-52 bomber can snap the wings off a smaller plane. For another B-52 bomber, it can cause a catastrophic stall. The aircraft shudders violently. The stall warning horn screams a piercing mechanical wail that cuts through the fog of exhaustion. The pilot snaps awake, adrenaline flooding his system, and hauls back on the controls. The engines scream as they fight for purchase in the thin Arctic air. The bomber groans, metal flexing before leveling out. They missed a collision by less than a quarter of a mile. On the Soviet radar screens, the blips merge and then separate. The operators in the bunker gasp. For a heartbeat, it looked like an impact. If those two planes had collided, 4 thermonuclear bombs would have plummeted into the ice. The explosion might not have been nuclear, the safety interlocks are robust, but the scattering of plutonium and the sudden disappearance of 2 strategic assets would have looked exactly like the start of a shooting war. The Soviets would have seen 2 flashes on the screen disappear. They would have assumed the Americans had been shot down. They would have fired back. The world came within a wingspan of destruction because a 20-year-old boy from Iowa fell asleep. But in Washington, the architects of this chaos are not asleep. They are watching the reaction, and they are worried. The plan was supposed to work by now. The madman theory, Richard Nixon's grand strategy, relied on a swift psychological break. He wanted the Soviets to rush to the North Vietnamese and scream, "Settle the war! Give Nixon what he wants! He is crazy, and he is going to kill us all!" But the Soviets are not rushing to Hanoi. They are digging in. The twist in the narrative arrives not on the ice, but in the plush, smoke-filled office of the Soviet ambassador in Washington. Anatoly Dobrynin is summoned for another meeting. This time, the performance by the Nixon administration reaches Academy Award levels. The Americans do not threaten. They apologize. Henry Kissinger plays the role of the worried subordinate perfectly. He speaks to Dobrynin with a tone of conspiratorial dread. He implies that the president is becoming unmanageable. He suggests that Nixon's obsession with Vietnam has pushed him over the edge of rationality. "I am trying to restrain him," Kissinger implies, but he is the commander-in-chief. He has his hand on the button. This is the masterstroke of the deception. It is not a threat of strength. It is a threat of weakness. It is terrifying. Dobrynin leaves the meeting shaking. He sends a cable to Moscow that is marked highest urgency. He reports that the American president is not bluffing in the traditional sense. A bluffer is calculating. Nixon, according to Dobrynin's assessment, is emotional. He is a man who might pull the house down just to kill the termites. In Moscow, this intelligence lands like a grenade. The Soviet Politburo is composed of hard men, survivors of Stalin, survivors of the Great Patriotic War. They respect strength. They understand brutality. But they do not understand unpredictability. Leonid Brezhnev reads the report. He looks at his generals. If he is mad, Brezhnev asks, can he be deterred? This is the moment the American plan backfires. Deterrence works on the premise that your enemy wants to live. If your enemy is insane, deterrence fails. If deterrence fails, defense is impossible. The only option left is preemption. Instead of calling North Vietnam to force a peace deal, the Soviets decide to prepare for the inevitable. Orders go out to the Soviet civil defense forces. In cities across Russia, air raid sirens are tested. Not the short tests, the long wails. The population is not told why, but the movement of trucks and the stocking of shelters sends a ripple of panic through the streets. More ominously, the Soviet military communications network switches to a wartime frequency. The National Security Agency, NSA, in the United States, picks up the shift immediately. The American listeners realize that the Soviet radio traffic has changed. It is no longer the casual chatter of peacetime maneuvers. It is the clipped, coded, rapid-fire bursts of an army getting ready to fight. The Americans suddenly realize they have pushed too hard. They wanted to spook the bear. Instead, they have backed it into a corner, and the bear is getting ready to charge. Back in the Arctic, the situation deteriorates further. The Soviets stop sending just the MiG-21 fighters. They send the Tu-95 Bear bombers. These are the Soviet equivalents of the B-52 aircraft, massive 4-engine turboprops with counter-rotating propellers that create a noise so loud it can be picked up by submarine sonar. The Tu-95 aircraft do not engage the American bombers. They fly underneath them. It is a display of pure dominance. The Soviet pilots fly their massive machines hundreds of feet below the American formation, rocking their wings. They are showing the Americans, "We are here, we are not afraid, and if you drop your bombs, we will ram you." It is a dance of dinosaurs. The American crews, delirious with fatigue, look down and see the red stars on the silver wings of the Soviet giants. The sky is crowded with nuclear death. Then, a piece of intelligence reaches the White House that changes everything. A spy satellite pass over the Soviet Union reveals that the mobile ICBM launchers, the SS-8 Sasin missiles, are not just moving, they are erecting. To fire a liquid-fueled rocket in 1969 takes time. You have to fuel it. You have to stand it up. It is a process that takes hours. Once you fuel a missile, you have to fire it or defuel it, which is dangerous and corrosive. You do not fuel a missile for a drill. The Soviets are fueling. President Nixon, sitting in the Oval Office, receives the briefing. The bluff has spiraled out of control. He wanted to look like a madman to force a diplomatic breakthrough. Instead, he has convinced the Soviet Union that World War III is inevitable, and they are preparing to fire first to save themselves. The giant lance is no longer a lance. It is a boomerang. Nixon faces a choice. If he keeps the bombers in the air for another day, the Soviets might launch. If he pulls them back now, he looks weak, and the North Vietnamese will know his threats are empty. But the decision is taken out of his hands by a sudden, terrifying incident on the Alaskan border. An American radar station picks up a fast-moving contact coming from the Soviet side. It is moving at Mach 3. It is a Foxbat, a MiG-25 interceptor, the fastest combat aircraft in the world. It is heading straight for the cluster of B-52 bombers. It is not slowing down. It is on an intercept course. The American flight commander screams into his radio, "Break formation! Break formation!" The disciplined box of 18 bombers shatters. The massive planes bank hard, scattering across the sky to avoid the incoming missile or ramming attack. The chaos is absolute. The MiG-25 screams through the center of the formation, the sonic boom rocking the bombers like toys in a bathtub. It does not fire. It pulls up, lighting its afterburners, climbing vertically into the stratosphere until it disappears. It was a warning shot, a final warning. The message is clear. The next one will not miss. The game is over. The Soviets have called the bluff. They have put their finger on the trigger and stared Nixon in the eye. The mystery of what will happen is solved. War will happen, unless the planes turn around. Now, October 30th, 1969. The breaking point arrives not with a bang, but with a crackle of static. Inside the cockpits of the 18 B-52 Stratofortress bombers, the radio operators receive a coded transmission from the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. The code is verified. The pilots check the sequence against the book strapped to their legs. It is not the launch order, it is the recall. Giant Lance is terminated. Return to base. The exhausted crews, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of endurance, initiate the slow, banking turns that will take them away from the Soviet border. The contrails that have scarred the Arctic sky for 3 days finally begin to fade. On the Soviet radar screens, the swarm of ghosts turns south. The operators in the buried bunkers watch them go. There is no cheering, there is no celebration. There is only the heavy, suffocating silence of men who have spent 72 hours waiting to die. The blips slowly crawl off the edge of the glass screens, retreating back toward Alaska, back toward the safety of the American hemisphere. In the Kremlin, the order is given to stand down. The silo covers in Kazakhstan slide shut. The mobile launchers are driven back into the forests. The submarines submerge, disappearing back into the crushing depths of the ocean. The world has survived. But the mystery is only now beginning to unravel for the historians who will look back on this moment. For decades, Operation Giant Lance remained buried in the classified archives of the United States. The pilots were told to never speak of it. The diplomats were sworn to secrecy. It was a ghost operation, a footnote in the history of the Cold War that was almost erased. But when the files were finally declassified, the true horror of what happened, and more importantly, why it happened, revealed a shocking truth about the American presidency and the fragility of nuclear peace. The shock is not that Nixon sent the bombers. The shock is that the entire operation was a theatrical performance based on a psychological theory that completely failed. It was called the Madman Theory. Richard Nixon believed that he could not win the Vietnam War through conventional military power alone. The North Vietnamese were too resilient, and the American public was too tired. He needed a lever. He needed to terrify the Soviet Union, North Vietnam's primary sponsor, into forcing Hanoi to the negotiating table. He told his aide, H.R. Haldeman, "I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip the word to them that, for God's sake, you know Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry and he has his hand on the nuclear button." Operation Giant Lance was not a military mission. It was an acting job. Nixon was playing the role of a lunatic holding a grenade in a crowded room, hoping that everyone else would freeze and give him what he wanted. He risked the incineration of human civilization not to defend the United States from an existential threat, but to gain leverage in a stalled peace talk for a proxy war in the jungle. And the most terrifying part of the reveal? It didn't work. The Soviets were terrified, yes. They mobilized their forces. They prepared for the end of the world. But they did not call Hanoi. They did not force the North Vietnamese to surrender. Why? Because the Soviets came to a different conclusion. They didn't see a madman who could be manipulated. They saw a volatile, dangerous America that could not be trusted. Instead of capitulating, the Soviet Union accelerated their own nuclear program. Before 1969, the United States held a significant advantage in nuclear delivery systems. But after the terror of Giant Lance, the Soviet leadership vowed that they would never again be placed in a position of inferiority where an American president could bully them with bombers. They began a massive buildup of intercontinental ballistic missiles. They built the massive SS-18 Satan missiles. They expanded their submarine fleet. They achieved nuclear parity with the United States within a few years. Nixon's gamble didn't shorten the Vietnam War by a single day. The war dragged on for another 4 years, claiming thousands more American and Vietnamese lives. The Paris Peace Accords were not signed until 1973, and they were signed on terms that were largely available in 1969. But the legacy of Giant Lance was far darker. It taught the Soviet Union that the Americans were willing to use nuclear terror as a diplomatic tool. It destroyed the fragile trust that had been built after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It pushed the world into the most dangerous phase of the Cold War, the 1970s and 80s, where both sides possessed enough firepower to destroy the planet 50 times over, and both sides were now convinced the other was crazy enough to do it. The pilots of the B-52 aircraft, the men who actually flew the mission, were pawns. They were risked in a high-stakes game of bluff that yielded zero return. They flew through blizzards, dodged Soviet fighters, and nearly crashed into each other, all for a strategy that was flawed from the start. When we look back at the Cold War, we often think of it as a chess game played by rational masters. We think of Kennedy and Khrushchev calculating moves. But Operation Giant Lance reveals the chaotic reality. It shows us that for 3 days, in October 1969, the fate of the world rested on the gamble of a president who was trying to pretend he was crazy and nearly succeeded in proving it. The bombers landed, the engines cooled, the nuclear cores were unloaded and returned to their bunkers. The pilots went home to their families, unable to tell them that they had just spent 3 days circling the drain of the apocalypse. The history books often focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis as the closest we came to nuclear war. But Giant Lance was in many ways more frightening. In Cuba, the conflict was over real missiles on an island. In 1969, the conflict was over a shadow. It was a crisis manufactured entirely by one man's desire to look tough. And it serves as a chilling reminder. The most dangerous weapon in the nuclear age is not the bomb itself. It is the mind of the man who holds the launch codes.